podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the seminar on globalization. Coming next, we discuss globalization as a polarized debate. It's a hot topic, in fact. There are very few topics, as polarized as globalization. And why? Because academic scholars or policymakers, officials, take stances regarding the benefits and pitfalls of globalization. So what we are going to do, is to tackle this debate in two ways. On the one hand, we're going to discuss the pro side of globalization, those scholars who focus, on the benefits of globalization. And later, we're going to discuss and take up, those who are against the anti-globalization group. This, of course, has to do not only with statistics regarding trade, capital markets, growth, economic takeoff, but also with socio-political issues such as the income gaps within and between countries, and also the role of the market versus the state, the role of global banks and multinational corporations. What about the impact of globalization on climate change and natural resource depletion? And what should be, the global leadership and security issues? How should they be tackled by official organizations and by national governments? All in all, globalization has to do with the very meaning of socioeconomic development. We can wrap up, those who are for and against globalization in two categories. Those who are for the market forces, starting with Smith, Ricardo in the 18th century and 19th century, Milton Friedman, 1960s, Walter Rostov, 60s, 70s, Friedrich Hayek, and Schumpeter. In the anti-globalization camp, as we shall discuss later on, we have, of course, Karl Marx in 19th century, 1850s, and then later on Keynes, followed by Minsky, and today Krugman, Stiglitz, and Kindleberger. These scholars, these two camps, can be lumped together in families of economic thoughts. We have Marx and the Marxist family, the so-called dependency school. We have the Keynesians and the neo-Keynesians, which can be called also the dissidents, those who are off the mainstream economic theory. And we have the liberals and the neo-liberals. But it's simple, to show these polarized debates as follows. Those who are basically against the intervention of the state, those who are for the free role of market forces, look at globalization as a positive sum game. It's a win-win. Everyone will win, and everyone, sooner or later, will catch up and will reach a state of sustainable economic growth. Now, those who look at globalization as a distorted growth process, as a zero-sum game, basically, given that globalization, yes, might be an engine of growth, but not of income distribution. In fact, they focus, on the pitfalls of globalization, including volatility, debt crisis, wealth gap, not only within, but also between countries. To sum up the classical liberal school, economic development is rooted in market-driven economic policies. And free trade is beneficial mutually. It's a positive sum game. And as capital will flow from rich countries to poor countries, the poor countries will catch up, will get access to larger investment, hence boosting their economic growth rate. In this case, the state should limit its intervention to the minimum to avoid any market distortion. Those who focus on the key role of the state, like the Keynesians, will say that free market competition is not good. It leads to capital concentration, to monopolies, hence eroding competition. And the state must intervene in order to regulate, and to foster sustainable global growth with equal income distribution. The key issue between the two camps have to do with the role of the state. In the neoclassical and monetary group, the lesser the state, the better. Why? The state's intervention will distort market economic forces. The market, is basically self-regulating, and any intervention, in fact, will lead to inflation, for example. There is no need to intervene because the economic agent is rational. And finally, monetary policy is too important to be left in the hands of politicians. Hence, central banks should be independent, no intervention. Of course, this is not at all what the Keynesians say. They say that the state should intervene in the economic field in order to regulate and provide a smooth growth rate in the long term, sustainable growth rate. Temporary budget deficits with large public spending is necessary to fill the investment savings gap and to bring a higher rate of employment. They also focus, on not only the quantity of growth, but the quality of growth. Hence, they look at income distribution and also at governance. Of course, conflicting diagnoses, regarding crises will lead to conflicting crisis management policies and strategy. The two sides, will basically favor totally different polarized, therapy in order to get a country out of a crisis, out of a recession. So looking at the liberal school, it focuses on 5 main policy tools. The first one is to encourage market-based economic policy. As I said, the lesser the state intervention, the better. Low taxes and limited budget deficit, the key role of market competition, and last but not least, economic development will lead gradually to political freedom. This classical school has its roots in the mid-18th century with Smith, with Ricardo, with John Stuart Mill, with Turgot, and with Gournay, Chevalier, and Le Play. This will lead to 3 European schools of thought: the Lausanne School with Walras, the Cambridge School with Alfred Marshall, and the Vienna School, well known with Friedrich Hayek. These founding fathers of the liberal school are either French or British. And they start, in fact, looking at the process of economic change in the 17th, 18th century on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And why? Because, like Turgot and Montesquieu or Gournay, what is at stake from their standpoint is basically, protectionism versus trade openness. Montesquieu, Gournay, and Turgot summarize their policy position by saying, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, no trade barriers. Adam Smith, as we shall see, focuses on market forces. Ricardo and comparative advantage, and James Stuart Mill, encourages trade. Trade is a positive sum game between importing countries and exporting. In order, for a country to import, it has to export, and vice versa. Montesquieu and Turgot look at trade as an engine of socio-economic growth, peace between nations and collective well-being. So it is not only an economic reflection, but a socio-political reflection. We are here in the heart of political sciences and not only economics. Smith focuses on the role of the market. The market is self-regulating and providing that the so-called invisible hand is at work, it will provide well-being for everyone. Competition is a key force in the market which brings about well-being socially and economically. The state should minimize its intervention, and trade restrictions, of course, are negative. Now, this doesn't mean that Smith is an apologist of the capitalist class. No, he says that the capitalists have both rights and duties vis-à-vis the workers in order to provide the forces toward income equality. Ricardo, very well known in the early 19th century, to provide the base for the comparative advantage framework. This takes place basically in the aftermath of the Waterloo defeat of Napoleon in 1815. What is at stake is a major policy debate in Britain between the peasants who call for maintaining strong agricultural protection as a key to preserve national security. They face, of course, the industrialists who in fact favor the trade openness in order to bring down the price of imported wheat and also the price of wages, labor cost. Well, Ricardo, will provide the industrialists with the key arguments, to impose their point. Free trade is mutually beneficial and leads to global welfare. How come? Well, it's enough for countries, to specialize in those production where they have a comparative, not an absolute advantage. This trade benefits stem from production specialization. And this specialization is itself rooted in the difference in the techniques of production, the combination of capital and labor and productivity. And provided one country has a comparative advantage in a specific production, it is in the interest of this country to specialize and to export its surplus production. Samuelson, well later, in 2004, will say, yes, of course, Ricardo is right. It makes sense to specialize. The comparative advantage is rational. But there will be both winners and losers. After all, productivity gains in China will in fact help China to catch up with the US. And China, might be in a good position to compete over the whole value chain. Not only, in labor-intensive products, but also in capital-intensive products. Then, the trade benefits can turn entirely, to the poor country, China versus the US. But Samuelson will not, of course, propose trade protectionism. He will conclude that, yes, indeed, poor countries, less developed countries will try to catch up by investing in capital-intensive products. But the end of the game, for developed countries is productivity. Investing in capital, in training, in education, in R&D, in innovation, in order to keep their comparative advantage. The countries who are in favor of globalization have set up very vocal organizations such as the Mount Pelerin Society, the Hoover Institute, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Heritage Foundation. And not only, they write reports on economic policies, but there are also strong lobbies with regard to governments. This has led Alan Greenspan to make a link between freedom of economic development and political freedom. Greenspan, the former chairman of the Fed, ends up, concluding that economic freedom will lead gradually to socio-political freedom. The only thing to do is basically to implement market-based economic policies like the US is doing. These scholars, look at the catch-up process. When does the takeoff take place? Well, this has been discussed a long time ago, since the 1850s, by Karl Marx, then by Bürger, and the French scholar Fernand Braudel. But I want to draw your attention on the work of Walter Rostov. Rostov uses an historical approach to socioeconomic development, and he tries to pinpoint at what stage in time, the takeoff takes place. And for Rostov, countries, have to move through 5 main stages of economic growth. Initially, the traditional society, where you don't have much savings, you don't have much trade between regions, between villages. Then you have the capital accumulation, which leads to the preconditions of takeoff. And like a nuclear reaction, suddenly the takeoff takes place. You have all the conditions, which are met in order to trigger economic growth and takeoff. Then the drive to maturity, the so-called BRICS, the fast-growing emerging market countries. And finally, maturity, hence the global mass consumption markets. Countries join the global market forces. What to do? It's basically simple. The recipe, is within 3 conditions: increasing the rate of productivity, focusing on the manufacturing sector, and developing, an institutional framework conducive to investment, risk-taking, and savings. Who is where? Well, Africa is probably in the first or second category. Asian countries between the second and the third. Latin America probably in the pre-maturity stage. And the OECD, including the USA, Western Europe, and Japan, in the maturity stage. If we look at the growth rate of these countries, the GDP per capita, we see little takeoff, or maybe in the case of South Korea in the mid-1980s, and for Thailand in the late 1980s. Yes, some takeoff has happened, but late and in a dispersed order. If we look at Latin America, we have definitely a takeoff which happens in Brazil in the mid-1970s, followed by Mexico in the late 1970s, and probably in Chile in the mid and late 1980s. But this means little regarding the quality of growth and the quality of the socio-economic process. It says little regarding the wealth distribution, the income inequality within and between countries. And as you can see on the screen, there is a sharp gap between the US and Eastern Europe, including France and the UK, and a very large gap between these developed countries and the most promising emerging market countries, such as Brazil and China. Pomerantz has tried to understand, what are the roots of the economic takeoff and the divergence between the UK and China in the 19th century. China, will not take off between basically the 1850s and the 1980s, whereas the takeoff in Britain takes place in the 1850s. And Pomerantz says that there is nothing to do with institutional development. In fact, looking closely at China, China had a relatively more liberal land market and probably more developed institutions than Britain. In fact, for Pomeranz, the key trigger, of the economic take-off in Britain and Western Europe is the role of energy resources. In particular, the fact that coal availability was much larger in Britain than in China. So in fact, market institutions are not the primary cause, for the takeoff. It's a combination, of course, of socioeconomic development and resource allocation, resource availability, plus the colonization, the war interventions by Western powers, France, Germany, and Britain, in China, which stopped at the time of the Opium War in the early 19th century, which stopped the development of China until the 1980s. Samuel Huntington, on his side, tries to understand, what will make a country moving towards sustainable socioeconomic development. And basically, he says that the key issue, the key obstacle to socioeconomic development is a lag between economics and politics. When you have, a delayed development in political institutions, this will make, development extremely difficult. So you need both economic development and political institutions going hand in hand. Looking on the graph, we have on the vertical axis the process of socioeconomic change, which can be presented, by using the growth rate of GDP. On the horizontal axis, we have the process of political, institutional development. And the game plan for a country in order to move from economic growth to long-term development is to maintain, hand in hand, two rates of growth combined between economic and political development. Otherwise, if you have much economic development and little political, institutional development, you will get a crisis of mediations, you will get social disorder. That's exactly what happened, in Burma, what exactly happened in China with the Tiananmen Square, and what happened recently, 2 years ago, with the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, in Libya, in Syria today, and probably also in Egypt. This stress on institutional building is also, supported by Kuznets. For Kuznets, globalization and economic development depend not only on economic growth, investment, but they are a mindset. Cultural development, values are important to transform economic growth into shared, equitable, social development. This stress on the combination between economic elements and institutional elements is also provided by the IFIs, international financial institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank. Basically, they say that economic growth is a byproduct of a combination of forces, including macroeconomic balances, low budget deficit, low inflation, but also institutional development. Of course, the key issue for the World Bank, for the IMF, is to keep a balanced budget and balanced external payments. Otherwise, sooner or later, the crisis will catch up and countries will have to embark on socially painful economic adjustment, in a nutshell, belt tightening. So for the World Bank and the IMF, good governance, strong institutions are the key to provide sustainable long-term development. When a country has a destabilized economic policies, the IMF will tell the country, to balance its budget, to shrink monetary and credit expansion, and to cut spending. And this gradually will lead to adjustment, and the IMF and the World Bank are there, to decrease the social impact of the economic adjustment with conditional financing. But if we look at the total view of the IMF regarding economic stabilization, it has to do not only with trade openness, with macroeconomic stability, with high savings and high investment in order to decrease foreign debt, but also with good market allocation, and last but not least, leadership and governance. So do not reduce the IMF, like a police cop, extremely tough on countries. Basically, the IMF says, adjustment can be postponed, it cannot be avoided. That's exactly, the lesson which has been given to not only Greece, but also Portugal, Spain, and maybe tomorrow to France. These policy measures, in order to transform economic growth into development within the globalized market economies, have been summarized by the so-called Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus has been developed by John Williamson in 1990 at the time of the meltdown of the Soviet Union, with around 20-25 countries shifting from centralized market economic policies under the strong control of the state toward market-based economic policies. And Williamson developed a number of policy advices, not only regarding budget balances, not only regarding trade, economic and financial deregulation, but also regarding income distribution and the focus on public spending on health, education, R&D, and innovation. This stress on free market policies is used by the Heritage Foundation in Washington to rank countries regarding their freedom of economic activities. And the best rated countries are also fast-growing countries, including in Asia, like Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, in Europe, Switzerland, Ireland, and the USA. France is far behind, number 67. It is considered to be still under extreme, tighter state control, and the BRICS are well behind. China is number 138, and Russia 144. Let's conclude by looking at this chart, which shows that there is a close correlation between, on the one side, capital openness to the global capital markets and economic growth. It seems to mean that countries, which embark on economic and capital deregulation are those which grow faster. Well, correlation doesn't boil down to causality. It's basically, the relationship between two variables, and it tells us little regarding the quality of economic growth, nor of the quality of socio-economic development, nor of the quality and sustainability of development. We shall take up this issue when we discuss those who are against globalization. Thank you.